September 26th, 2012 was supposed to be just another routine drug deal in a forgotten corner of West Africa, but it was the day the system finally caught its own ghost. Inside a hotel room overlooking the Atlantic in Monrovia, a heavy-set man sat calmly at a table covered with contracts, shipment schedules, and profit projections, speaking in the low, measured tone of someone who had survived far worse rooms than this. He believed he was closing a multi-million-dollar cocaine deal. He believed the risk was priced in. He was wrong. The door exploded inward without warning, drywall and splinters filling the air as armed federal agents flooded the room. Weapons raised, voices sharp and absolute. In less than 60 seconds, the man was zip-tied, slammed against the wall, and stripped of the illusion that he was untouchable. To anyone watching, it looked like another international narcotics bust, another trafficker caught, another headline waiting to be written. But this was not a trafficker. This was not even a kingpin in the traditional sense. The man in cuffs was the architect of a criminal empire so vast and so abstract that it barely existed in physical space at all. He had never sold drugs on a street corner, never handled a brick of cocaine, never stepped foot in the United States. Yet, his systems had flooded American homes with painkillers, fueled addiction, moved tons of narcotics across oceans, laundered hundreds of millions of dollars, and ordered murders with the same emotional detachment most people use to send emails. And as the DEA jet lifted off the Liberian runway 6 hours later, screaming east over the Atlantic, something far more dangerous than an arrest was already in motion. The man the system had finally captured was no longer thinking about escape. He was thinking about how to turn the system itself into a weapon, and how many people he could take down with him before it was over. Long before there was blood on spreadsheets or indictments stamped with federal seals, there was only a boy who trusted machines more than people. He grew up awkward, quiet, and intensely focused, the kind of child who disappeared into logic, because logic never humiliated him, never misunderstood him, never left him behind. Computers obeyed rules. Systems made sense. If something failed, it was because of design, not betrayal. By his teenage years, he was teaching himself advanced programming not to impress anyone, but because it gave him control in a world where he felt none. Code became a refuge, then an identity. In his early 20s, he wrote encryption software powerful enough to alarm governments and impress elite technologists. The irony is cruel millions would eventually rely on ideas he pioneered, yet his own life barely moved. Praise didn't pay rent. Respect didn't translate into stability. He watched corporations and institutions absorb brilliance while offering nothing back, and slowly, quietly, resentment began to harden into worldview. This wasn't a tantrum or a moral collapse, it was a conclusion. If intelligence wasn't rewarded, then the system itself was flawed, and flawed systems were meant to be exploited. He didn't abandon ethics overnight. He optimized around them. The internet of the early 2000s was still a frontier wide open, poorly regulated, built by people who assumed good faith. While others saw convenience and innovation, he saw seams places where rules lagged behind reality. When Americans began searching for painkillers online, he didn't see desperation or addiction. He saw demand without structure, money, without ownership, chaos begging for design. And that was the turning point. Not the moment he chose crime, but the moment he decided that if the world was going to run on systems, then he would be the one designing them, and no one would ever be able to take that power away from him again. What he built next didn't look like crime at all. It looked like infrastructure. There were no dealers, no dark alleys, no hand-to-hand exchanges, no visible violence. On the surface, everything appeared clean, professional, almost boring. Websites with polished layouts promised prescription pain relief delivered discreetly to your door. Intake forms mimicked legitimate medical questionnaires. Licensed U.S. physicians appeared to review cases. Small-town American pharmacies filled orders. FedEx trucks did the rest. Each piece examined on its own complied just enough with existing rules to avoid immediate suspicion. But when stitched together, those pieces formed something far more dangerous than a drug ring. They formed a system that law enforcement didn't yet know how to name. The brilliance and the menace was in the design. He never touched a pill. He never met a patient. He never spoke to a doctor or a pharmacist directly. He didn't need to. He sat behind a laptop watching dashboards populate with order volume conversion rates, shipping times, and profit margins the same way a Silicon Valley founder might monitor user growth. When a website was shut down, 10 more appeared overnight. When spam filters adapted, his infrastructure adapted faster. Money flowed through offshore accounts in jurisdictions chosen not for secrecy alone, but for legal ambiguity. By the time regulators began asking questions, the system had already processed thousands of daily orders and quietly extracted hundreds of millions of dollars from American households. This wasn't greed in the traditional sense, it was momentum. The machine worked, and machines are seductive when they work. But beneath the efficiency lay consequences no spreadsheet could fully capture: addiction, spreading silently; pills, accumulating in kitchen drawers; overdoses misfiled as statistics. He saw none of it directly, and that distance mattered. Distance turned harm into abstraction. Abstraction made everything easier. The system rewarded speed, not reflection scale, not restraint. And as the operation grew, something fundamental shifted. What began as exploiting a legal gray area hardened into a belief that invisibility itself was power, that if no single hand appeared to be breaking the law, then no one could truly be held responsible. It was the perfect crime for the digital age, not because it hid wrongdoing, but because it dissolved it into code logistics and plausible deniability. And by the time anyone realized how much damage had already been done, the system was no longer asking for permission, it was simply running. There comes a moment when money stops feeling like a reward and starts feeling like background noise. And for him, that moment arrived quietly, almost unnoticed. By the time regulators began tightening the screws, the system was already throwing off more cash than he could reasonably spend, yet satisfaction never followed. Profit had proven the concept. Now, he wanted dominance. The same logic that had optimized online pharmacies began searching for new terrain, and the answer was obvious. If pills could move through loopholes, then so could anything else. Cocaine, methamphetamine, gold, timber, weapons. Each new commodity slid neatly into the framework he already controlled. Shipping routes became interchangeable. Customs officials became variables to price in. Bribes were cheaper than compliance. Risk was no longer something to avoid. It was something to engineer. As the scale expanded, the human element became the weakest link. Partners skimmed. Employees talked. Loyalty eroded under the weight of fear and greed. He didn't respond with anger or theatrics. He responded with policy. Violence entered the operation not as chaos but as process. Kill orders were typed, reviewed, and executed with the emotional distance of a performance evaluation. The first time someone died because of a decision he made, it didn't feel like a line crossed. It felt like a problem solved. That realization mattered. From that point on, there was no moral slope left to slide down, only efficiency to maintain. He began hiring men whose resumes weren't measured in degrees or certifications, but in deployments and body counts. Former soldiers trained killers, people who understood orders without questions. They didn't protect him, they enforced the system. Each death sent a message not of rage, but of inevitability. Cross the operation and the machine will correct you. The programmer who once believed systems were fair had become something far colder, a man who believed systems were justified simply because they worked. And as blood joined the balance sheets, the empire hardened into something that could no longer retreat. The logic that built it now demanded constant expansion, constant control, until the only remaining question wasn't whether it would collapse, but how violently. For years, the system circled him without closing in, not because it lacked power, but because it understood patience. Investigators didn't chase headlines or kick down doors. They watched patterns, mapped flows, and waited for the smallest fracture in an otherwise flawless design. That fracture came from a man deep inside the machinery, a logistics coordinator who understood the routes, the money, the timing, and who finally understood that loyalty in this empire only flowed one way. From that moment, the trap was built slowly, deliberately, with the same precision its target respected. A deal was floated that looked irresistible: high-value product, clean routes, minimal exposure, and profit large enough to justify the risk. It spoke directly to the mindset that had carried him this far: confidence born of repetition, success mistaken for invincibility. He didn't rush. He vetted. He tested. When everything checked out, he did what he always did when the math made sense. He showed up, hence he. The meeting in Liberia felt familiar, almost routine. Contracts reviewed, terms discussed, timelines confirmed. He was calm, composed, already mentally spending money that hadn't yet moved. That calm is what makes the moment so stark. When the door came down, it wasn't just an arrest, it was a rupture. Years of invisibility collapsed into seconds of chaos. In that instant, the system he had outpaced for so long finally intersected with his physical body. But even as zip ties cut into his wrists, something else was happening behind his eyes. Panic never arrived. Regret didn't surface. Instead, the same cold calculation that had built an empire activated again. The deal was over. A new one was already forming. He understood that capture wasn't the end of leverage, it was the beginning of a different kind. And as the aircraft carrying him lifted off toward the United States, the most dangerous phase of the story quietly began. What happened next unsettled even the people who had spent their careers dismantling criminal networks. Most informants talk out of fear, desperation, or regret. He spoke out of strategy. Sitting inside a secure federal facility, he didn't posture bargain emotionally or plead for mercy. He analyzed the situation the way he always had: inputs, outputs, incentives. Life in prison versus cooperation. Irrelevance versus continued control. And then he made an offer that flipped the power dynamic entirely. He wouldn't just explain how the empire worked. He would help destroy it from the inside. What made this dangerous wasn't the information. It was the access. He still knew the codes, the voices, the rhythms of command. His lieutenants believed he was hiding, regrouping, still watching everything, and so the illusion was maintained. Messages went out through encrypted channels written in the same clipped, authoritative tone they had followed for years. New jobs were assigned. Meetings were scheduled. Travel plans were approved. To the men receiving those orders, nothing felt off. This was just business. They boarded planes believing they were collecting payments, enforcing discipline, eliminating problems. Instead, they walked into waiting agents and locked gates. One by one, the most dangerous pieces of the network were removed without gunfire, without chases, without resistance. It was psychological warfare conducted with surgical precision. The man who had once hired killers now used trust itself as the weapon. The cruelty of it was almost abstract. These were people who had killed for him, who had risked their freedom believing the system protected loyalty. Now they learned too late that loyalty had always been a one-way transaction. For investigators, the results were extraordinary. For the targets, the betrayal was absolute. And for the architect, there was a strange continuity to it all. Even in custody, even stripped of freedom, he was still doing what he had always done best, running a system efficiently eliminating risk and maintaining control. The empire was collapsing, but the logic that built it was still very much alive. By the time he stood in a federal courtroom, the empire existed only as exhibits and testimony. Numbers replaced faces. Charts replaced bodies. The scale of the damage was undeniable: multiple murders, tons of narcotics, weapons trafficking, and hundreds of millions of dollars extracted from lives that would never appear in financial reports. The judge read the facts slowly, methodically, describing a criminal operation so vast it sounded almost fictional, yet every word was anchored in evidence. Families of victims sat silently behind him, listening to their losses summarized in legal language that could never capture what had been taken. The sentence that followed landed with a strange weight. 25 years. Not freedom, but not the lifetime many expected. The logic was clear: without his cooperation, dozens of violent men would still be free, entire networks intact. The law rewarded results, not morality. Still, the imbalance lingered in the room. The men who pulled triggers on his orders received life without parole. The man who typed those orders would age in a cell, but one day walk out. Justice had been delivered according to the rules, yet it felt unfinished, like a ledger that balanced on paper while remaining deeply wrong in the gut. The courtroom emptied, but the question stayed behind, unresolved and heavy. When the case files were sealed and the headlines faded, the damage did not. Addiction does not end when a website goes offline. Violence does not reverse when a network collapses. Trust once broken at that scale does not quietly repair itself. Former associates scattered, unsure which messages had been real and which orders had already been monitored, replaying years of obedience with the sickening realization that the voice they followed had turned against them long before they knew. But the deeper aftershock landed far beyond the criminal world. This story unsettles because it isn't just about drugs or betrayal, it's about systems. The same mindset that builds efficient platforms, optimizes logistics, and scales ideas globally can just as easily scale harm when restraint is removed. Intelligence without accountability becomes dangerous. Distance turns consequences into abstractions, and when success is measured only by output, morality becomes a rounding error. The most uncomfortable truth is that this empire didn't collapse because it was poorly designed. It collapsed because its creator chose to dismantle it when the cost-benefit equation changed. That realization lingers, forcing a question that extends far beyond crime. If one person can build and destroy a global operation from behind a keyboard, what responsibility comes with that kind of power, and who decides when the system itself has gone too far?